Welcome to E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. We are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a blue-collar worker or white-collar worker, small business owner or corporate executive, you belong in this community. In a world where workplaces often feel starved of connection, where deadlines and deliverables crowd out listening and care, empathy can feel like the missing piece. Mimi Nicklin, empathy advocate and best-selling author of Empathy at Work, has dedicated her career to closing what she calls the global empathy deficit. Her work reminds us that empathy isn't weakness. It's the quiet strength that binds teams together, fuels creativity, and sustains us through change. In this conversation, Mimi invites us to look beyond the surface of leadership and success and into the heart of what it means to truly see and hear one another at work. She shares stories, insights, and practices that show how empathy can transform not just our workplaces, but our wider world. If you've ever felt the ache of disconnection at work, or wondered what it would look like to lead both with courage and compassion, this episode will remind you that empathy is not a soft skill. It's a crucial leadership skill. This is E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy. Welcome to the show, Mimi. It is such a delight to have you here. I've been following you on social media and, watching all of your inspirational messages and observing you from afar. I read your book, Empathy at Work. So super excited to dig into the content of this book because it's definitely a powerful force for good. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you. And Rebecca, all these years later, every single individual who says, "Oh, I read your book," I think like, "Oh, thank gosh someone's reading it," So thank you for taking the time to read it and for inviting me and just for, sharing an empathy with me, because it's not that often that I get to speak to a host that loves empathy as much as I do. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'd love to just talk first about your journey because it's such an interesting one, and you talk about it in your book too, how you came to this place where you are now. You are basically a voice in the empathy space. You've gained such a huge following on social media, and I think it's just a testament to the powerful message that you're putting out there. I'd love to know, as you went along your life journey, was there a specific experience in your own career or even your personal life that made you realize that empathy wasn't just this nice to have soft skill? And I love how you call it a hard skill.
Yeah.
Because we don't. We all just throw around the term soft skill in the workplace. So what was that pivotal moment for you?
Well, first of all, the reason I kind of nodded a lot in the middle of that sentence was when you spoke about the powerful message. I just don't think it's my powerful message, right? I think empathy is a powerful message. And I think that this rise in the awareness is not because of my voice. I think it's just because of two things, actually. I think the world has changed, Rebecca. The world has caught up with perhaps what I and people like you were seeing already years ago. And the second thing is the number of voices in this field of interest has also gone up. So when I started this, I felt very alone in that passion, right? In the passion for empathy and creating more of it in the world. But today I get to meet people like you. And there are many people, especially on your side of the world, who are interested in this conversation as well. So it has risen. Was there a moment? No, but there were a couple of things that happened and a couple of pieces of data that kind of really convinced me this was a space. So in 2018, I had moved to the Middle East, to Dubai, which is a very modern city on the eastern side of the world. But when I moved there, and I moved there to take over a big American business, a small department, a regional department of that American business, I was very surprised to find that the business I took over was not in the, let's say, positive standing that I perhaps had been led to believe when I took the job. And I went in as a leader for this regional business in a country I had never been into, in a culture that at the time I knew very little about, even though I had been in the wider region, so in Asia Pacific and Africa, for my entire adult life. Actually, I had never worked in the Middle East before. And at the point when I was trying to work out how to fix this business, I went to meet a business coach and I sat with her over lunch, and she was asking me about my leadership style and how I was going to, persevere through this utter turmoil that I was in at the time. And I was talking about intuition. I was talking about being an intuitive leader, which I had believed my entire career to that point, which was probably about 15 years by then. And she stopped me and she asked me a question that probably changed my life in the end, because she asked me, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time I thought, no, like it's not empathy, right? What's empathy got to do with anything? Certainly to do with the workplace or leadership. But when I left that meeting, I started to research empathy again. This is 2018, and discovered what is now known as, or even then had been circulated as, the empathy deficit. And when I came across this term, I was so amazed that nobody seemed to be talking about this, And the deeper I dug, the more impact, the more influence I felt that this empathy deficit was having on all kinds of areas. And this was pre-COVID. So this was before the world changed, shall we say. So in terms of an event, this conversation was that event. Until this conversation, I was very focused on my career in marketing and advertising. And even with this conversation, it's not like something changed overnight. I just started to write about it and what this empathy was and what it meant and how it could be connected to the world. And I remember thinking, well, no one else is speaking about it. Again, on my side of the world, there were always a group of people in the States that were talking about it at the time. But on my side of the planet, nobody was talking about this. So I thought, well, I can talk about it, right? Maybe nobody will read it. And I don't think they did, but I'll keep writing about it. So, that's what I did. And I guess when I say there was one sort of moment with this lady, but there was also a couple of facts, because when I started to research that, I remember very clearly the day that I was looking at the connection between empathy and longevity, so how it impacts our lives. And I remember being in my house at the time, and for the first time reading the data around death rates in children, so in youth, so 14 to 24, and the fact that the second biggest killer of our youth was no longer vehicle accidents, but suicide. And I didn't know anything. I mean, I still know I'm not an expert in this at all, but I knew very little at the time. But what I felt like I did know was that we were doing something wrong, right? That
Mm.
if our children feel so disconnected to us that they would rather not stay on the planet, then maybe this deficit was bigger than we thought. And so between the conversation and some of the data, that was how it all begun.
That's so powerful. That brings up so many questions in my mind. But the first thing that comes to my mind when you talk about children is what I find working with leaders, and I don't know if you've experienced this as well, is that oftentimes when we start to get further along in our journey with the leadership team, we
Mm.
start to unpack deeply rooted beliefs and internal demons that are behind their leadership style or what's preventing them from being an effective leader. And it all stems from childhood. We had a leader just the other day say, yeah, actually, I grew up with a bunch of brothers and I was always just defensive as a child because I had to constantly defend my territory. And now
Mm.
as a leader, she finds herself being defensive of her team all the time, and she's trying to unravel that behavior and that habit. So it kind of connects to what you're saying about how we're treating our children really affects how we behave as adults when we grow up. And if we're not taking care of our children and showing empathy towards our own children, then yeah, we're not preparing people for for a positive future.
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to talk to you about, so you had mentioned you were hearing bits and pieces of empathy in the Western world and
Mm.
not so much where you were in Asia or even the Africa region, but I am interested in the different cultural nuances and what you've learned as an expat, because I've also been an expat myself and I've seen what it's like to put myself in others or people's shoes in different cultures and really feel what they're feeling and understand why they behave the way they do. And what I found living in the United States is we talk a lot about empathy here, but I don't know if we necessarily live it very well. We're very kind of to each his own kind of culture. It's very individualistic. We're not community based. When I lived in Europe, it felt a little bit more community based. Like people were more supportive of each other, and there were more places for people to gather. And here in the US, everything's so spread apart and people are in their cars all the time. So it's very like very if you work really hard, you'll succeed, living the American dream, right?
Mm.
And if you failed, it's because it's your fault. I know that sounds harsh, but I feel like other cultures around the world are much more supportive and community based. And I really loved what you talked about when you lived in South Africa about the Zulu culture and how they greet each other and how they engage with one another. Could you kind of talk about that experience living in South Africa and also just living in other countries, what you've learned from other cultures and how that may have helped
Mm.
you be an even better, more empathetic leader?
That's a really big question. Or maybe it's a really big answer. I think the first thing I'll say is that it took me a long time to realize that living around the world had impacted me so much. So when
Mhm.
your very last sentence there was how it impacted, your leadership or how you show up to lead. And I think I've done it for so long because I left when I was maybe 22. I lived in Latin America for a while. So I think my entire life I have lived actually within other people's cultures. I have spent very, very few years of my life living in a British culture, which is where I was born. And that has been a very clear decision for me. And I think what you were speaking about there, Rebecca, about that individualism, for whatever reason, when I was put on this planet, it doesn't matter what passport I had or where I was born or to the parents that I was born to, that individualistic culture was just never going to work for me. And that was very clear from very young for me. I never wanted to stay in it. I couldn't have told you then that that's what I was escaping away from and moving towards was community. I couldn't have told you that. But many years later, now I can see that very clearly. So I would say that your point around the Americas and Europe, perhaps you found it better. But to be honest, the whole West, so that would be, the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, fundamentally. South Africa, a little bit in some of the more developed cities, where they carry very Western cultures. They are just far more individualistic. And if I was to generalize of my whole adult life, which has been in Asia Pacific, the Gulf, and Africa, this part of the world is far more collectivist. And when
Mm.
you have more collectivist societies, you do have higher levels of natural empathy. And my take on that, although I do not have the research to prove it, is that we just practice more in these communities. Like you said, we spend a lot of time in the car. I smiled when you said that because it kind of is what I imagine when I think of the US as well, right? There's big
Sure.
highways, huge cars. Um, let's talk about Asia and the Gulf, perhaps, as one wider region. People are always together. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. There is a very strong sense of religion. That's not to say there isn't in the Western world, but perhaps in parts of Asia and the Gulf, it takes up even more of life. There is a very strong sense around communal eating. In many of these countries, again, these are all generalizations, so excuse me, but for the sake of conversation, for example, I live in Malaysia, which is where I am tonight. And when you have lunch break from the office in Malaysia, nobody is eating at their desk, right?
Oh,
They go
that's
to
wonderful.
yes, they eat together. I remember when I first moved to Singapore, which was one of the places I've lived. That took, the Singaporeans have a very Chinese work culture in many ways, and what that means is that they work very seriously and very long hours. But when it came to lunchtime, there was also a very serious commitment to eating together. Right, they're not going to eat their rice at their desk or whatever they choose to eat. Right, so a lot of communal eating and living. And I think the third part is the role of family. Family still has a very deeply entrenched role across the region in terms of multi-generational commitment and engagement. So in many homes in this side of the world, you will find multiple generations in that home. So the grandparents, their children, their grandchildren. And I just met someone the other week who's living with his great grandson, right? So there's 4 generations in
That's
one
so
home. So all of those things really shift the way we practice empathy. So that's my take, at least currently, Rebecca, is that one of the reasons you see such higher levels of empathy in collectivist societies is simply because this is a life skill. And like any skill, the more you practice it, the better you're at. And that is not to say that this side of the world is unilaterally better, just that you see more levels of natural empathy. And when you ask about Africa and the Zulu culture, for example, I lived in South Africa 7 years, and I just have a huge passion for many of their tribes and tribal learning. South Africa has many official languages and tribes within the country. One of them is Zulus, one of the larger ones. And that's who I was writing about in the book. The Zulu culture has a word that they use to greet each other, which is sawubona. And you would use it like hello, when you meet someone. But the meaning of sawubona is not hello. The meaning of sawubona is I see you. And the reply to that is a recognition that I see you too. And that's why I wrote about it in my first book so passionately, because could there be a greater showing of empathy than to literally say to the person, I see you today? And that person goes, yeah, I see you too. Right? I mean, you feel amazing just saying it. So I think that level of communal interrelationalness, I think I made that word up, but if it were a word, you're going to see it in many traditional cultures, right? Whether that's African cultures, Asian cultures, Native American cultures, many cultures, right? Cultures that have a consistent belief into that interrelational relationships and interfamilial hierarchies, you're going to find more of that. So I don't want to talk anymore because I could just talk for hours on this theme, but those are some of the things that come to mind about what have I learned, and that sort of connection between individualism and collectivism and its impact on empathy.
And that's fascinating to me. And what I'm curious about is, even though the collectivist cultures seem to have this advantage already when they come into the workplace, but clearly you wouldn't have a job right now if that was the case. If the collectivist cultures were all so empathy driven that they were bringing it to work and leading with empathy and doing a great job, you would not have any business. So I'd like to go back to the topic of the empathy deficit. And you referenced in your book Barack Obama's reference of the empathy deficit at his graduation speech to Northwestern University students in 2006. I told my husband, we need to watch this commencement speech before I interview Mimi, because I want to see where it's placed in the speech and what his context is. And 2006 is the year I graduated from university as well. So I wanted to put myself in the shoes of those students and imagine absorbing that message as a 22-year-old and what that may have done, how that may have impacted them. So it was very powerful at that pivotal moment right before he was elected to become president in 2008. We were definitely at a crossroads in the United States of, who are we? What do we represent? Everybody was looking for hope. And that was his message, right? His presidential message during his campaign. And it resonated across both parties, which is why he was elected. So what is it about this global deficit that you're seeing, Mimi? So even in Malaysia, in the regions that you serve across Asia, even in collectivist communities where empathy comes naturally, what's falling short in the workplace? What's missing? Like, why are we so empathetic at home and then coming into the workplace and just losing sight of it? What are you seeing?
Like, the first thing I'll say, Rebecca, is I actually don't think we're empathetic at home. So even in this side of the world where there are natural levels of empathy because of communal and more community-based living, people are more stressed and more sick than they ever have been in history, right? And the sad thing is we created and continue to create that for ourselves, right? So we are our own worst enemies. I often talk about empathy having two great enemies, actually. According to the work I do, one is low time and the other is high stress. And we are living in a world with no time and very high stress. So because it's a skill set, because empathy is built into the prefrontal cortex, it has to be an intentional choice. I have to choose to listen to you. And of course, if you look at basic neuroscience and just to understand how the brain works, when the brain is under high pressure, stress, anxiety, the parts of the brain which are being fed by our oxygen, our blood, put simply, are not the parts of the prefrontal cortex which are actually there for kind of creative thinking, collaborative thinking, strategic thinking, because we're living in survival mode. And all around the world today, we are living in survival mode. Often we don't know it. And I think the pandemic started it. like started that anxiety on a level that perhaps we never knew. And my take on that is because until that point, we had this vision, this belief that we had control. And I think what the pandemic did in different ways in different parts of the world was made us realize we have no control, actually, right? When your government says, stay inside your house, do not open the front door, you stayed inside your house and didn't open the front door. Except until that point in life, we all were running around thinking that we were all very empowered with complete control over our choices until somebody or someone or some people took it away. Now, in some countries like Malaysia, I wasn't here then, but that home-based, not full lockdown, but that home-based lockdown went on for nearly 3 years. So regardless of where you were in the world, I feel like that pandemic began this shift of mindset away from feeling in control towards one of anxiety. When you sort of recognize that we feel so out of control, and then you realize that 24/7, we can watch the worst possible news around the clock on every platform and any channel we choose, that puts us into a fear status nearly the whole time. When you add to that the pressure to win in the workplace specifically, right? So the double-digit growth and all of these things, and then underline that with all the rationalization that's happening. So how many people, I'm sure in the States, because I also have many American clients, say we used to have a team of 10 and now we've got 3. But of course the work has gone up and not down.
It sounds
So,
familiar.
right? So I think we're living under huge stress. We're trying to fit in more and more and more. You and I spoke just before we came on air about kind of motherhood and how you manage working motherhood. Again, it's never been harder, right? It's never been harder for women, which is obviously 50% of the population, to be able to do all the things that we're supposed to do in a day, a week, or a year. The enemy of this empathy is the world that we have created for ourselves. It's our context, not necessarily the content. So often when I'm running these workshops or these sessions with leaders, it's about maybe the first coffee break. So like an hour and a half, 2 hours in, that someone will come to me in the break and say, Mimi, I just realized I don't think I've listened to anyone in my whole life. And it's normally a man, but I always say to them, don't worry, you're not alone, right? Because none of us have been listening to anyone for so long. We're just really out of practice and we're under huge amounts of stress. So I think it's a very, very complicated time. What I do think, and you mentioned that speech in 2006, the world is very different today than it was in 2006, 20 years later. However, I think that need for hope is exactly the same. Maybe it went up and went down and went up and went down, or maybe it stayed the same. But I do think that people need a way to reconnect to themselves and to the people around them. And perhaps that's why there's more people that are open to the message of empathy that you and I create in the world than perhaps there were before.
So, based on what you're saying, there is hope. So
There's definitely hope. I see it every day.
thank you for giving us that glimmer of hope today. So those same business leaders who are coming up to you during the coffee break and saying, "Oh my gosh, I haven't listened to anyone in my entire life." I've also had leaders approach me and say, all this empathy stuff sounds great, but I'm worried it's going to dilute holding my
Mm,
team accountable and also performance. I've also talked to some people in my podcast where they've implemented some of these techniques with senior leaders, and then they go back to their organization and they freeze because they're afraid to
mm,
implement it. They're afraid of what leaders will think, or they might think, oh, he's, came back from this retreat all wishy-washy empathy. People don't take it seriously. And I'm wondering, how do you coach leaders through that to show how empathy really does make an impact? Because I think your case study of you coming in to lead this advertising agency that was suffering tremendously, and you basically turned it around. I think that story is a great case study. So how do you convince leaders that this really does make an impact on performance? This will help you. It's not just this nice to have soft skill that, you know,
mm.
on a good day to have on a good day.
Look, I don't believe that we can actually convince anyone of anything, actually, really. So I never really try. What I instead do is try and create the understanding, the data, the picture for those people when I'm, on stage or with an audience that I am clearly so passionate about, and that has such compelling data that they convince themselves, right? Because the only way to sustain behavioral change is from the inside. So there's no point in my mind, me teaching them listening exercises and better ways to give feedback and all of these technical realities that bring empathy to life. As you say, if it just sits on a retreat or an exco meeting or a training session and it's not in their daily life, I think that people have to come away after that first tea break thinking, what she says, I want to do that, and also just telling them it's really hard. You mentioned their soft skill, and I spend a lot of my time saying to people, this is not a soft skill, right? It's a hard skill. It's hard to find, it's hard to master, it's very hard to practice. When you do active listening activities with senior leaders or any level people in the workplace, and then I often I get them to do these exercises, and then afterwards all I ask them is not about the takeaways or any of that. I just ask them, like, how did it feel? And within, like, the first one or two people will say something kind of wishy-washy, for your term just now. By the third or fourth person, someone will go, it was really hard. And I'm like, exactly, right? And then once one person says it, they all say it, right? These are really hard to do. So I think they have to come away from those sessions knowing what I'm asking of you or what I'm suggesting to you. It's not a concept. I'm not asking you to follow a framework. I'm hoping to paint the picture that will change your mind. But again, I don't tell them that, obviously, because they need to work that out themselves. I believe that's the only way. And I think, Rebecca, it's working, because I often get messages afterwards, like on LinkedIn or somewhere. And often senior men will write to me and say, thank you for the workshop. And then they'll say something like, I think you changed my relationship with my wife forever. Now, of course, I don't talk about relationships, very much. I'm definitely not an expert in marriage, but that's what they take away. And that's them, not me, right? I didn't tell them this, empathy will save your marriage, although it probably will. They work that out, they work that out themselves. So that's my approach. That's why I don't overcomplicate what empathy is either. There's various forms of empathy, there's various models, there's a whole lot of psychology behind it, and I teach none of it. It's not that I don't know it, I just don't think they need to know it. I think the empathy deficit is so deep and the problem is so huge that all we need them to take away is that maybe things will be better if I did this a little bit more. Like, if I listen to my team, in fact, if I just use their names a few more times in a week, will it be incrementally better than if I don't? Probably. That's it. Because that's enough, Rebecca, right? The problems we have in the world are so insurmountably huge that if we can just make micro shifts that doesn't come across, to your point, of coming back wishy-washy and soft, and they don't have to embrace all of it, but they just have to make something better than it was before, then I think, for me at least, I feel I did something worthwhile today.
I love that idea of micro shifts and baby steps, because otherwise it seems completely overwhelming and daunting. So if there's a leader listening today thinking, I have no idea where to start with this or how to implement this in my business or in my life, what would be that very first very small shift you would recommend they take? Is it listening?
I think listening is the backbone to all empathy in life, whether that's as a parent or a leader or a teammate. But listening is very multifaceted. But if I had to give one step, and I briefly touched on it then, I would just say use people's names. Our
Mhm.
names are the first gift we were ever given. And when you hear your own name, something triggers in your brain, including a release of oxytocin. It has a very big impact for a very small word, right? So if you're in a meeting and you use people's names more often and just say, Rebecca, do you think we should follow this process? Or what was it you were saying last week? The minute you're like, oh, yeah, me, yeah. Okay, this is what I think, right? If you're in the hospitality industry, for example, in hospitality, most people have name tags, right? Whether they're in coffee shops or security roles, or most people, like the people in hotels, use their names. It totally shifts things. And I'll tell you a story, Rebecca. I was on an aeroplane earlier this summer, and at the end of the plane, it was a long haul flight. I was very lucky. I was in a business class seat because my client was sending me somewhere. And at the end of that flight, the air host came and gave me a box of chocolates. And I could see that he was not giving everybody a box of chocolates. So I sort of looked at him and I said, well, thank you. But what? Like, what's the chocolates for? And he said to me, well, ma'am, you are the first person to use my name all year. But it was July. So
Wow.
business class is, what is that, like 15 people maximum? So it's a small cabin, but there's not 200 people he's serving. He's serving 15 for a long haul flight. And nobody can use his name. It just goes to show the power, right? When somebody sees you, it goes back to that Zulu, Sawubona, I see you, right? So if you're a leader listening and you think, there's just too much, I'm too stressed, I've got too much to do, the list is already long, I would love for you not to feel like this is another thing you must learn. This is not a concept. This is a memory, and you were born with it. We all know it. And this goes back, Rebecca, to how do you convince audiences of something? I think this is a really important part. I'm not trying to teach you something you didn't know. I'm just reminding you of something you already know. And using people's names is a really easy way to start.
That is such a wonderful example, Mimi. I am just dumbfounded that flight attendant went through 6 months of serving people on an airplane and no one mentioned his name. That's incredible to me.
Crazy, right? Yeah, it's amazing. And, just day before yesterday, I was in Bangkok, so the capital of Thailand, so huge city, and it has a river in the middle of the city. So often you travel by boat to get to places in the city. And I had arrived at the destination of where this boat was going down through the city. And I was watching, and there was a young man who jumped off the boat first and moored it, tied the rope around the thing to keep the boat in place. And there must have been maybe 25 of us on this boat. And I waited. I watched everyone. Nobody looked at him. Nobody looked at him. They just got off the boat and carried on. So obviously when I got off, I looked at him. I can't speak Thai, but I can say thank you, and I smile and I look at him for like a second more and he smiles back because the other 24 people didn't see him, right? He's invisible to them. It happens all the time. Everybody's ignoring everybody. And how sad is that?
That's very sad. It's certainly given me some food for thought for the day and how I'm going to approach people as I engage with the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
right.
we all just need to put down our phones and look around us. It's that's
Yeah.
really, really inspiring. Well, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Mimi, for sharing your wisdom with me. I know it's late in the evening, your time in Malaysia, so thank you for staying up with me and having this dialogue, and yeah, thank you for sharing your gifts with the world. Really, I know you're making an impact.
Thank you. And I'll tell you something, just one last thing, Rebecca. Somebody left me a voice note yesterday. Do you do that in the US? Do you use voice notes in the US on WhatsApp?
I have WhatsApp because I used to live in Europe and a lot of my friends there use it. People use it here, but it's not very frequent. And the only person who leaves me voice messages is my friend who lives in Germany.
Oh, well, there you
So
go. So
anyway,
maybe
so there you
it's
go.
the other side of the world. But certainly in Asia, WhatsApp is huge. And people do lots of voice noting rather than just typing. And the
Mm.
reason I say that is somebody sent me a voice note yesterday from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, so not very local to me. And one of the things he said is, I want to recognize the impact that you don't know you're making. And I thought, to your sort of final point there, that it's really inspiring also for your listeners to realize that so much of this decision making, so much of using people's names or seeing people or any of these things makes such a huge impact that we have no idea about. It's not to do with likes on a LinkedIn post or how many podcasts you do in a month, although I'm extremely grateful for being here. But I think it's more than that, Rebecca. I think the fact that you are on episode 74, did I get
Yes.
that right? There we go. Right? 74 episodes of having this conversation is making such a huge impact for the world. And probably people don't tell you that enough. So thank you for doing that. And for everyone listening, just remembering that we don't always see the results of these things immediately. But when you put them all together, maybe they'll change the world. We can only try.
Absolutely. Every small step counts.
It does. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.